That tree was more than just wood and leaves to me. It was a living monument, and when he cut it down, he didn't just break a branch. He broke a federal law and a piece of my soul. But was I partially to blame? My name is Alex, and for the better part of a decade, my life in this quiet suburban cul-de-sac had been defined by a peaceful, predictable rhythm. The centerpiece of that piece was the towering white oak that stood sentinel in my backyard, a giant my grandfather had planted 70 years ago. It wasn't just a tree, it was a legacy. It was also, as the small, discreet metal plaque at its base certified, a designated and protected habitat. This wasn't some flimsy city ordinance. Its status was enshrined in a specific federal law protecting the migratory birds that nested in its upper branches every single year. This idyllic existence began to fray the day Mr. Henderson moved in next door. He was a man whose personality was as sterile and meticulously manicured as his lawn. Where my yard was a bit wild and welcoming to nature, his was a putting green, a patch of unnaturally vibrant turf where no weed or stray leaf dared to exist. Our shared property line ran directly under the sprawling canopy of my oak, and from the moment he arrived, the tree became the focus of his quiet, simmering resentment. He'd stand on his pristine patio, hands on his hips, glaring up at the branches as if they were personally offending him. "Quite the mess it makes," he'd comment, his voice tight, as he watched a single leaf drift onto his perfect emerald carpet. "Casts a long shadow, too. Hard to grow prize-winning roses in a shadow." I tried to be patient. I really did. I'd invite him over for a beer, hoping some casual conversation would soften his edges. I'd point up at the canopy, alive with the chatter of finches and chickadees. "It's a whole world up there," I'd say. He'd just grunt, his eyes fixed on a patch of clover near my fence line, probably calculating the optimal herbicide concentration to eradicate it. The real point of contention, the one that made the tree more than just my property, was the birds. Not the year-round residents, but the purple martins. Every spring, like clockwork, a whole colony would arrive from their winter in Brazil, seeking out the specific hollows and cavities in the old oak's upper limbs. They were the reason for the plaque, the reason for the federal law. Their nesting site was considered critical. My grandfather used to say their arrival was the true start of spring, a promise kept across thousands of miles. Their swooping, acrobatic flights at dusk were a neighborhood spectacle. People would bring their kids to the edge of my yard just to watch them. It was a beautiful, shared experience, and if you're someone who appreciates moments like that, the kind that connect us to nature and each other, maybe take a second to subscribe. It helps me share these stories. I explained all of this to Mr. Henderson one afternoon. I walked him to the base of the oak and pointed to the small, weathered plaque. "See?" I said, my voice friendly, trying to make him an ally. "It's federally protected. Because of the martins, they're a vulnerable species." He squinted at the plaque, then up at the branches, his lip curling in a faint sneer. "So you're telling me I can't have a decent lawn because of a few birds and some old piece of metal?" He didn't seem to grasp the concept. To him, the federal law wasn't a vital protection for a fragile ecosystem. It was a personal attack, a bureaucratic shield I was hiding behind to justify the mess. The passive aggression soon curdled into active hostility. One Saturday, I came home to find a professional-looking arborist on his lawn, pointing a clipboard at the massive limbs extending over the property line. My heart hammered against my ribs. I walked over, my hands already clenched. The arborist, a young guy, looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Henderson here was asking for a quote," he said, "to remove any branches overhanging his property." "You can't," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "This entire tree is protected. You can't touch it. It's against federal law." Mr. Henderson stepped forward, a smug little smile on his face. "I'm only talking about what's on Form's side, Alex. My property, my right to sunlight." He was testing me, pushing the boundary to see how I'd react. That was the moment I knew this wasn't going to end with a handshake. It was the first clear shot in a war. One never wanted to fight. The confrontation with the arborist left a sour taste in my mouth. But in the weeks that followed, an uneasy quiet settled over the cul-de-sac. Henderson retreated behind his perfectly trimmed hedges, and I allowed myself to hope that my firm stance on the federal law had been enough. I saw him on his patio, as usual, but his glares seemed less frequent, his posture less confrontational. I was a fool to believe it was over. The change was subtle at first. A patch of leaves on a lower branch, one of the thick arms that stretched over his immaculate lawn, began to look unwell. They were yellowing, curling at the edges, looking like autumn had arrived 3 months early for just that one section of the oak. I tried to rationalize it. A fungus, maybe? A localized blight? But the sickness was isolated, confined with an unnatural precision to the limbs hanging directly over his property line. A knot of ice formed in my stomach. One evening after he'd retreated inside for the night, I took a flashlight and walked the fence. The air on his side was different. It carried a faint, acrid chemical scent, like weed killer but harsher, more industrial. I knelt, shining the beam along the base of the fence. There, in the soil just on his side of the line, I saw them. A series of small, unnaturally round holes drilled into the dirt, angled down towards the root system of my oak. They were fresh. He hadn't been glaring at the branches. He'd been admiring his handiwork. He was poisoning it. The realization hit me not with a hot flush of anger, but with a cold, terrifying clarity. This wasn't about sunlight or leaves anymore. This was a deliberate, calculated act of destruction. He was trying to kill the tree from the roots up. A slow, insidious murder he thought he could deny. He was attacking the very foundation of the thing the federal law was meant to protect, gambling that wilting leaves were harder to prosecute than a chainsaw. I didn't even knock. I stormed onto his patio the next morning, my hands shaking with a rage so profound it felt like a physical illness. He was out there, of course, sipping coffee and reading the paper, the picture of suburban tranquility. "What did you do?" I didn't shout. The words came out as a low, guttural growl. He folded his paper with infuriating slowness, placing it neatly on the table beside him. He looked at me, then followed my gaze to the sickeningly yellow leaves on the overhanging branches. A tiny, triumphant smile played on his lips. "Looks like your tree isn't feeling so well, Alex," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Pity. The holes, the chemicals. I know what you did, Henderson." He stood up, his smugness hardening into a glare. "You can't prove a thing. My lawn requires a specific regimen of care. If some of your overgrown weeds' roots happen to get in the way of that, it's hardly my fault. There's no federal law against fertilizing my own property." That was it. That was the moment the floor fell out from under me. He had found a loophole, a coward's way to wage his war. He wasn't just breaking the law, he was mocking it. He was mocking me. He was going to kill my grandfather's legacy, one poisoned root at a time, and stand there smiling while he did it. All my attempts at peace, at reason, at neighborly conduct, evaporated in that instant. This was no longer a dispute. It was a declaration of war, and he had just fired the first, most venomous shot. I didn't dignify his denial with a response. I just turned and walked away. The image of his triumphant smirk burned into my mind. The rage was a physical thing, a tremor in my hands and a pressure behind my eyes. But beneath it, a cold dread was spreading. He was right. It was my word against his. How do you prove intent when the weapon is a bottle of something poured into the ground under the cover of darkness? My first instinct was to call someone, anyone with a badge who could do something. I went straight for the phone, my fingers fumbling as I dialed the non-emergency police number. I needed a record. I needed an official report. I needed the system to work. An hour later, a weary-looking officer named Miller was standing in my backyard, patiently listening as I laid out the whole story. I pointed to the yellowing leaves, the plaque at the base of the oak, and explained the significance of the federal law protecting the nesting site. I even walked him to the fence line, pointing out the faint chemical smell and the disturbed earth where I'd seen the holes. "He's poisoning it," I finished, my voice tight. "He practically admitted it to my face this morning." Officer Miller sighed, a long, drawn-out sound of a man who had seen too many petty neighbor disputes. He strolled over to Henderson's side of the fence and knocked on the patio door. I watched from my yard as Henderson emerged, the picture of calm cooperation. He gestured, he shrugged, he pointed at his own pristine lawn. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read the performance. "Twice me? I'm just a guy who loves his garden. My neighbor? A little high-strung, you know?" When Officer Miller came back, his expression was set. "Sir, Mr. Henderson states he's been using a deep-root fertilizer for his rose bushes near the fence. Says it's a special blend. He denies putting anything harmful in the ground." "Fertilizer? That's a lie," I sputtered. "There's a chemical smell. The leaves are dying right above where he did it." "I understand your frustration," the officer said, his tone becoming placating, the kind you use on a hysterical child. "But without a sample of the soil and a lab test to prove there's a prohibited substance, and then somehow proving put it there with malicious intent, my hands are tied. The holes could be for aeration, the leaves could have a blight. From a legal standpoint, there's nothing to act on." "But what about the federal law?" I insisted, my voice rising in desperation. I pointed at the plaque again as if it were a magic talisman. "This isn't just a tree, it's a protected site. He's knowingly destroying it." Officer Miller gave the plaque a cursory glance. "That's a matter for a federal agency, sir. Fish and Wildlife, maybe. And they're going to need more proof than I do. Right now, this is a civil dispute. You can hire a lawyer, get an arborist to take samples. But as far as a police matter goes, I can't do anything." He tipped his hat. "My advice? Try to work it out with him." He left me standing there, the official report I so desperately wanted now just a useless entry in a logbook somewhere. The system hadn't just failed, it had dismissed me. It had looked at a clear case of deliberate destruction, shrugged, and labeled it a squabble over a fence. The fear I'd felt earlier was gone, replaced by a terrifying sense of isolation. Henderson knew the system's weaknesses. He knew he could hide behind plausible deniability and bureaucratic red tape. The federal law was a shield, but it was useless if no one was willing to hold it. I was alone in this, and as I looked up at the dying branches, I knew Henderson wouldn't stop until the whole tree was dead. The officer's parting words, "Try to work it out with him," echoed in my head for days, a bitter, mocking mantra. Work it out. As if I were dealing with a rational person, not a man engaged in a slow-motion execution of my family's legacy. The system had looked me in the eye and told me I was on my own. The following weeks were a special kind of hell. I watched, helpless, as the poison did its work. The sickness spread from the lower branches like a gangrenous infection, creeping up the trunk. What was once a vibrant canopy was becoming a skeletal caricature, a patchwork of green and dying yellow. The dread was a constant companion, a weight in my chest every time I looked out my kitchen window. Then, one bright April morning they arrived. The purple martins. They sliced through the sky in a dizzying, chattering cloud, returning from a continent away to the home that had served their ancestors for generations. But this year, the home was failing. I watched them circle the upper branches, their familiar, joyful calls sounding confused, almost distressed. Some landed, exploring the hollows, but the tree was visibly weakened. Their arrival, usually the happiest day of my spring, felt like a funeral. They were the entire reason for the federal law, and I, their designated guardian, was failing them. That was the breaking point. If the authorities wouldn't gather evidence, I would. I spent $200 on a motion-activated trail camera, the kind hunters use. That evening, under the cover of dusk, I strapped it to the trunk of the maple tree in the corner of my yard, camouflaging it with a few leafy twigs. It had a perfect, clear view of the fence line and the base of the oak. A small, desperate part of me felt a surge of hope. Let him try his deep-root fertilizing now. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, I was checking the camera's memory card when I saw it. It was a video, time-stamped at 3 a.m. Henderson, in his pajamas and robe, flashlight in hand. He wasn't carrying any chemicals. He was just standing at the fence, staring directly at the spot where the camera was hidden, a slow, deliberate scan of my yard. Then, he looked right into the lens. He couldn't have known for sure, but he suspected. And on his face wasn't guilt or fear, but a look of profound, incandescent rage. The game was up, and he knew it. His retaliation was swift and terrifyingly personal. That Saturday, he didn't sneak out in the dark. He strode onto his patio in broad daylight, wearing a full-body disposable suit and a respirator mask, looking like a plague exterminator. In his hands was a high-pressure, gas-powered sprayer with a tank on his back. He fired it up, the motor screaming to life and shattering the weekend quiet. He wasn't aiming at the roots. He was aiming up, into the limbs of the oak on his side of the line, sending a massive, billowing plume of atomized liquid into the air. A thick, chemical fog of what he would later call mite and fungus treatment drifted across the property line. It descended on my yard, on the patio where I drank my morning coffee, on the small vegetable garden my grandfather had taught me to plant, on the birdbath the finches used every afternoon. The acrid smell burned my nostrils and throat, forcing me back inside. Choking, I slammed the sliding glass door shut and watched in horror. He was methodically dousing every leaf and branch on his side, but the wind carried the poison everywhere. He was rendering my entire backyard toxic, a sterile, chemical wasteland, all under the guise of legitimate yard work. I pounded on the glass, but he couldn't hear me over the engine's roar. He just kept going, a faceless monster in a white suit, methodically poisoning my air, my soil, my sanctuary. When he finally cut the engine, the silence was more jarring than the noise. He pulled off his mask, his face beaded with sweat and flushed with exertion. He saw me standing at the door, and his lips pulled back into a snarl. "Your diseased tree is attracting pests," he shouted, his voice raw. "It's a hazard. I have a right to protect my property from its filth." And I knew. The camera had changed everything. The slow, deniable poisoning was over. This was his new narrative, his new justification. The tree wasn't just an inconvenience anymore, it was a hazard. He was no longer trying to hide. He was building a case, creating a pretext in the open. The federal law was just a piece of paper to him, and he had decided it was time to tear it up. He wasn't going to poison the roots anymore. He was going to take an axe to the whole damn thing. The pest control was a declaration, and the days that followed were lived under its shadow. My backyard, my sanctuary, was now a toxic zone. A chemical sheen coated the birdbath. The vegetable garden withered, its leaves brown and curled as if torched. The air itself felt tainted, and I kept the windows shut even on the most beautiful days. The purple martins, the very birds the federal law was written to protect, were the most tragic victims. Their numbers dwindled. Some abandoned the oak entirely, seeking healthier skies. A few remained, listlessly flitting between the dying branches, their acrobatic displays replaced by a weary lethargy. I sent the trail camera footage, the video of him staring into the lens, followed by footage of his chemical assault, to every email address I could find for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I called their regional office, navigating a phone tree from hell, only to leave a frantic message with a bored-sounding receptionist who promised an agent would review my file. The system that had felt dismissive before now felt like an impenetrable fortress of apathy. I had provided clear, irrefutable evidence of intent and escalation, and the only response was the crushing silence of bureaucracy. Then came the 4th of July weekend. My sister had been planning a family reunion for months, a trip I couldn't back out of without causing a major rift. The thought of leaving the oak unattended for 3 days filled me with a primal, gut-wrenching terror. It felt like leaving a sick child in the care of a murderer. Before I left, I walked the perimeter of my yard one last time, my eyes scanning the skeletal upper branches of the tree. Henderson was on his patio, watching me. He didn't sneer or shout. He just watched, a placid, unnerving calm on his face. It was the look of a man who had already made his decision and was simply waiting for the opportune moment. The entire trip was a blur of anxiety. I couldn't focus on conversations, couldn't taste the food. Every ring of my phone sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I called my other neighbors, asking them to keep an eye out, but what could they do against a man so brazen? The long weekend stretched into an eternity. Monday evening, I drove home under a sky bruised with the sunset, my stomach in a tight, painful knot. The dread was so thick I could barely breathe. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that even Henderson wouldn't dare do the unthinkable on a holiday weekend. I turned onto my street. The cul-de-sac was quiet, littered with the festive debris of spent firecrackers. Everything looked normal. I felt a small, foolish flicker of relief. Maybe I had been wrong. Maybe the threat was all in my head. And then I heard it. It wasn't the pop of a firecracker or the drone of a lawnmower. It was a sound that cut through the evening, calm like a scream, a high-pitched, mechanical roar, punctuated by a deep, splintering crack that vibrated through the frame of my car and into my bones. It was the sound of a professional-grade chainsaw, biting deep into old hardwood. It was coming from my backyard. I didn't even put the car in park. I threw the door open, the engine still running, and scrambled out, stumbling on the curb. The roar was louder now, a visceral, gut-tearing shriek that seemed to be coming from the center of the earth. I fumbled with the latch on the side gate, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work it, and burst into my backyard. The scene was a nightmare rendered in sawdust and exhaust fumes. He was there, Henderson, in the center of my yard, standing before the great white oak like a profane executioner. He had a massive orange chainsaw in his hands, its blade sunk deep into the trunk. A huge, wedge-shaped chunk of the oak's heartwood lay on the grass beside him. Sawdust, thick as a blizzard, filled the air and coated everything in a pale, deathly film. High above, the remaining purple martins wheeled in a panicked, chaotic spiral, their calls sharp with terror. The tree itself seemed to be groaning, a low, structural agony with every fresh bite of the chain. "Henderson!" I screamed, my voice cracking, lost in the engine's deafening howl. He didn't hear me. He braced himself, revved the engine, and sank the blade deeper. A sickening crack echoed through the cul-de-sac as another slab of wood tore free. I ran at him, not even thinking, my mind a white-hot blank of pure rage. I grabbed his shoulder and spun him around. "Stop! What are you doing?" Startled, he killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the frantic chirping of the birds and my own ragged breathing. He pulled the chainsaw from the gash in the trunk and let it rest on the ground. He looked at me, his face flushed with exertion, his eyes gleaming with a terrifying, triumphant fire. This was what he wanted. He wanted me to see it. "Finishing the job," he said, his voice calm, matter-of-fact. He gestured with his chin towards the massive wound in the tree. "It was a hazard, Alex. Diseased. I'm doing the neighborhood a favor." "You monster," I whispered, staring at the gaping hole. It was like a mortal wound in the side of a great beast. "The federal law. I'm calling the police, the feds, everyone." He laughed. It wasn't a chuckle. It was a short, sharp bark of utter contempt. "Go ahead, call them." He took a step closer, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial sneer. "You still don't get it, do you? You think this was ever about leaves? About sunlight?" He shook his head, a pitying look on his face. "I bought this house 6 months ago for one reason, to get rid of this tree." The world tilted. The buzz of the saw still echoed in my ears, but his words cut through it all. "What are you talking about?" "I'm a developer, Alex," he said, spreading his hands as if revealing the simplest secret in the world. "Or I will be, this cul-de-sac, 2 lots combined. It's the perfect spot for a 4-unit luxury townhouse build. Your lot, my lot, together they're worth $3 million. But no one would touch it with a federally protected liability sitting in the middle of it." He pointed a sawdust-covered finger at me. "So I did my homework. I tried the subtle approach, but you and your little camera got in the way. It all crashed down on me. The purchase of the house, the meticulous lawn care, the poisoning, the escalation. It wasn't a neighbor dispute. It was never personal. It was a business plan. A cold, sociopathic, malicious calculation." "The federal law," he scoffed, kicking at the chunk of heartwood on the grass. "I looked it up. The specific statute your little plaque refers to. You know what the maximum penalty is for destroying this habitat? A $10,000 fine." He smiled, a wide, predatory grin. 10 grand is a rounding error, Alex. It's the cost of a permit. I'll pay it with a smile. Now, you can either sell me your property for a reasonable price, or I can wait for this thing to die, fall on your house, and buy the land from your insurance company. He had won. He had taken the system I had put my faith in, the very law I thought was my shield, and turned it into a line item on an expense report. I looked from his smug face to the dying tree, to the terrified birds still circling their ruined home. I felt a hollowness so profound it threatened to swallow me whole. He was right. I didn't get it. I had been fighting a war of emotion against an enemy who only spoke the language of money. He picked up the chainsaw, preparing to start it again. Last chance to watch. And then, something in my brain, worn smooth by weeks of frantic, desperate research, clicked into place. The plaque, the agency, the birds. My obsession with the federal law wasn't just about the tree. It was the whole ecosystem. "You're wrong," I said, my voice quiet but clear. He paused, the pull cord in his hand. "What?" "You read the wrong law," I said, a sliver of adrenaline cutting through my despair. I pointed a trembling finger up at the circling martins. "That $10,000 fine is for destroying a designated habitat. That's one crime. But the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, that's a different animal entirely. It makes it illegal to pursue, hunt, take, capture, kill, or attempt to do the same to any protected migratory bird. That includes willfully destroying an active nest with eggs or chicks in it." His smug expression faltered, just for a second. "Those birds," I continued, my voice gaining strength, "have been here for weeks. They are nesting. Right now. Up there. I can see the nests from here. Each one of those is a separate violation. A separate charge. And it's not a fine, Henderson. It's a felony. It carries prison time." I took a step toward him, my finger now pointing at the maple tree in the corner of my yard. "And that camera? It's been recording for 3 days straight. It recorded you starting this. It recorded the birds. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who I've been sending everything to, now has video evidence of you, in broad daylight, committing multiple federal felonies. You didn't just calculate a business expense. You documented your own path to a federal penitentiary." The chainsaw slipped from his grasp, thudding onto the grass. The color drained from his face, replaced by a pasty, grayish shock. The triumphant developer vanished, leaving only a scared, stupid man in his place. He stared at the chainsaw, then at the tree, then up at the birds, as if seeing them for the first time. His cold, calculated risk had been a catastrophic miscalculation. He hadn't just failed to read the fine print. He had failed to understand what the federal law was actually protecting. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, broken only by the thud of the chainsaw on the soft grass. Henderson stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, the gears of his $1,000,000 calculation grinding to a halt. The blood-drained, pasty shock on his face was my first real taste of victory, and it wasn't sweet. It was metallic and cold, like the adrenaline that had been coursing through me was finally turning to ice in my veins. The victorious developer was gone. In his place stood a man who had just gambled his life on a Wikipedia summary of the law and lost. My own body felt distant, my hands trembling, not with rage anymore, but with the aftershock of it. I pulled out my phone. My thumb was so unsteady I had to press it against my leg to dial 911. 911. "What's your emergency?" a calm voice asked. "My name is Alex. I'm at 12 Miller Court," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I need police and an agent from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I have a man on my property who has just attempted to cut down a federally protected tree, and in doing so is in the process of committing multiple felonies under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. I didn't shout. I didn't plead. I just stated the facts, laying them out like evidence on a table. I could hear Henderson's ragged breathing. He took a half step back, his eyes darting between me, the camera on the maple tree, and the gaping wound in the oak. The whole world had been his for the taking a minute ago. Now it had shrunk to the confines of my backyard. The local police arrived first, sirens cutting the evening quiet. To my surprise, it was Officer Miller who stepped through the gate. He took in the scene, me, the pale and trembling Henderson, the massive chainsaw, and the brutal gash in the oak, and the weary disinterest was gone from his face, replaced by a look of grim seriousness. "What in God's name happened here, Alex?" he asked, his eyes wide. "He was cutting it down," I said simply, "just like I told you he would." Henderson finally found his voice, a reedy, panicked thing. "It was a hazard. The tree is diseased. I was protecting my property. This is a civil matter," he stammered, grabbing for the words that had protected him before. "Sir, put your hands behind your back," Miller said, his voice leaving no room for argument. The time for plausible deniability was over. The system I had tried to activate weeks ago had finally roared to life, prompted not by my pleas, but by the undeniable scream of a chainsaw. As Miller cuffed a sputtering Henderson, 2 more cars pulled up, these ones unmarked sedans. 2 people in crisp jackets with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service emblazoned on the back stepped out, a man and a woman. They moved with a quiet authority that made the local police presence feel provisional. I walked them through it, my voice still shaking slightly, but my thoughts sharp and clear. I pointed to the plaque, the gash in the trunk and the circling, distressed purple martins. "He confessed the whole thing," I said. "He's a developer. He said the $10,000 fine for destroying the habitat was just a business expense." The male agent glanced at Henderson, who was now pleading with Officer Miller. "He said that, did he?" "Yes," I said. I pointed to the trail camera. "And this has been recording everything. His confession, the chainsaw, the active nests up there. It's all on a memory card." The female agent looked up at the nests, then at the chainsaw, then at the terrified birds. "He's right," she said to her partner. "The nests are active. This isn't a fine. Each count is a felony." That was it. The final nail. Henderson heard her, and a sound came out of him, a guttural noise of pure despair. He wasn't a smug developer anymore. He was just a criminal who had been caught. He had treated the federal law like a minor inconvenience, a toll booth on his road to riches, but he'd missed the sign for the armed checkpoint right behind it. The federal agents took over. They collected the chainsaw as evidence. I carefully removed the memory card from the camera and handed it to them. They took my official statement, not with the placating tone of a man dealing with a neighborhood squabble, but with the focused attention of prosecutors building an ironclad case. I watched them lead Henderson to one of the sedans. He looked back at me one last time, his face a mask of disbelief and ruin. There was no anger left in him, only the hollow shock of a man whose world had been dismantled by a law he thought he could buy his way around. As the cars pulled away, their taillights disappearing down the cul-de-sac, I was left alone in the sudden, profound quiet of my violated sanctuary. The air still smelled of exhaust and savaged wood. The great white oak stood before me, grievously wounded but still standing. High above, the purple martins, slowly, tentatively, began to settle back into the branches of their maimed but surviving home. The war was over, and I had won. But standing there in the wreckage, it felt less like a victory and more like a terrible, necessary survival. The days that followed were not filled with relief, but with a hollow, echoing silence. The legal machine, once so inert, was now grinding away with terrifying efficiency. I gave more statements. I spoke to lawyers from the U.S. Attorney's Office. They used terms like open and shut case and overwhelming evidence. Henderson, stripped of his assets and facing a prison sentence that would consume the rest of his productive years, was a ghost, a name on a legal document. I had won, but every night I was jolted awake by the phantom roar of a chainsaw, the imagined scent of exhaust and pine, my heart hammering against my ribs. My sanctuary was gone. The backyard was no longer a place of peace, but a crime scene. I couldn't look at the great oak without my eyes being drawn to the horrific, gaping wound in its trunk. An arborist, a specialist in veteran trees sent by the federal agents, came to assess the damage. He wrapped the gash in a special burlap, packed it with a compound to prevent disease, and installed a series of cables high in the canopy to brace the weakened structure. The tree would live, he said. It was a survivor, like me, but it would forever bear the scar, a deep, ugly reminder of the violence it had endured. The cables looked like stitches, the burlap, a bandage. My monument to legacy had become a monument to trauma. The federal law, the phrase I had clung to like a holy mantra, now tasted like ash in my mouth. I had believed in it as a shield, a passive, noble protection. But it wasn't. It was a weapon, and it did nothing until I picked it up and wielded it with the same cold calculation as my enemy. It didn't prevent the poison. It didn't stop the chemical assault. It didn't stop the chainsaw from biting into the heartwood. It only offered retribution, not protection. My faith in the system had been replaced by a grim understanding of it. The law wasn't a benevolent guardian, it was a set of rules for a fight, and it only cared who was left standing at the end. I became a prisoner in my own home. Every time a car I didn't recognize drove down the cul-de-sac, a jolt of anxiety shot through me. The sound of a neighbor starting their lawnmower made me flinch. I found myself watching the street from my window, a paranoid sentry guarding a fortress that had already been breached. The peace I had once taken for granted was gone, replaced by a constant low-grade hum of vigilance. Henderson had done more than attack a tree. He had poisoned my sense of safety, leaving a residue far more toxic and lasting than any chemical he had sprayed. The Purple Martins, the reason for it all, were the most painful reminder. They stayed, but their colony was smaller, their evening flights less exuberant. They were survivors in a damaged home. Watching them felt different now. It was no longer a simple joy. It was a heavy responsibility, a constant reminder of the near catastrophe and the brutal fight I'd had to wage on their behalf. They were the living embodiment of the federal law, and looking at them, I no longer felt the quiet pride of a guardian. I felt the bone-deep weariness of a soldier after a long and bloody war. About a month after they took Henderson away, I walked into the local police station. The antiseptic smell and the bored-looking officer behind the plexiglass were a stark contrast to the storm that had upended my life. I didn't have an appointment, but I wasn't leaving. I asked for Officer Miller. He met me in a small, windowless room with a formica table and 2 plastic chairs. He looked tired, but the weary condescension from our first meeting was gone, replaced by a cautious respect. "Alex," he said, sitting down. "I heard the U.S. Attorney's Office is going for the maximum. Good. What he did?" He shook his head. "I'm not here to talk about Henderson," I said, my voice flat and even. I had rehearsed this. The rage was gone, boiled away into something harder. "I'm here to talk about you. And me. And our first conversation." His eyes tightened at the corners. He remembered. "Look, I know how it looked. But at the time, all I had was a he said. "You had more than that," I interrupted, but I kept my voice low. "I told you about the dying leaves. I told you about the chemical smell. And most importantly, I showed you the plaque. I told you about the federal law. And you told me it was a civil dispute. You told me to try to work it out with him." I let the words hang in the air between us. My hands were tied, Alex, without proof. "That's the point," I said, leaning forward. "You were looking for proof of property damage. You were thinking about state and local ordinances. You saw a squabble over a fence. You didn't see what was really happening. He wasn't just poisoning a tree. He was attempting to destroy a designated habitat. That was a federal crime in progress. The moment he started, he was in violation. But because it had a federal label, you decided it wasn't your problem. You told me to call Fish and Wildlife, an agency I'm sure you know is understaffed and overwhelmed. You passed the buck." Miller had the decency to look uncomfortable. He looked down at his hands on the table. "Your advice to work it out almost got that tree killed. It led to him escalating, to him spraying my entire property with poison, to him finally taking a chainsaw to it. The only reason he's in a federal holding cell instead of a new townhouse is because he was stupid enough to confess to me on camera, and I happen to know a specific clause in a century-old law." I paused, letting the weight of that luck settle in the room. "The system shouldn't run on luck, officer." He looked up at me, his expression grim. "What do you want, Alex?" I want change, I said. I want it so the next person who calls you, frantic because a neighbor is trying to destroy a protected site, doesn't get told it's a civil matter. I want your officers to be trained to recognize the words federally protected as an immediate escalation trigger, not a jurisdictional hot potato. I want there to be a protocol. When a citizen reports a potential violation of a federal law like this, you don't just log it, you make a call. You get the right people involved from the start. You create a record that the federal agents can use. You put the offender on notice that the local police are watching, even if the case belongs to another agency. I slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a typed-up summary of my experience and a proposal for a new dispatch and response protocol. I'd spent 2 weeks writing it. Miller picked it up and read it. He read it twice. The silence in the room stretched on. Finally, he folded the paper and looked at me. "You're right," he said, his voice quiet. "You're absolutely right. We saw it as a tree. We should have seen it as a crime scene waiting to happen." He tapped the paper. "I can't make promises, but I will walk this directly into the chief's office. I'll tell him it's not a suggestion. It's a lesson we learned the hard way. Or, rather, you did." I walked out of the station and into the bright afternoon, feeling a sense of closure that the court proceedings could never give me. Back at home, I stood in the yard and looked at the oak. The burlap bandage was still wrapped around its trunk, a stark reminder of its wound. But for the first time, I saw something else. My fight hadn't just saved the tree. It had, in a small but meaningful way, reinforced the shield. The law was still a set of rules for a fight, but I had just helped teach the referees in my town how to see the foul. The peace I had lost was never coming back, not in the same way. But in its place was a new, heavier sense of purpose. I was no longer just a resident. I was the guardian. And my watch had just been extended. The phantom roar of the chainsaw faded with the summer. It took months. For a long time, the sound of a distant leaf blower or a contractor's nail gun would send a jolt of ice through my veins. But slowly, with the help of a therapist who was very good at listening, the echoes began to quiet. The hypervigilance remained, a low hum beneath the surface of my days, but it no longer held me hostage in my own home. Autumn arrived, and with it, a crisp, clean air that seemed to scrub the last of the chemical residue from my memory. The purple martins were long gone, their annual journey south, a natural, peaceful departure this time. I knew they would be back. The great oak, my oak, stood scarred but resolute. The arborist's burlap bandage was a constant reminder, but the leaves that remained had turned a brilliant, defiant gold. The tree was healing, and I decided it was time I did the same. The small vegetable garden, the one Henderson had drenched in poison, was a patch of dead, barren earth. I had avoided it for weeks, another corner of my sanctuary that felt tainted and lost. One Saturday morning, I went to the hardware store and bought a pickaxe, a shovel, and 10 bags of rich black topsoil. The work was brutal. I broke up the compacted, dead ground, shoveling the contaminated dirt into contractor bags for disposal. It was a physical exorcism, sweat stinging my eyes, my muscles screaming with every swing of the pickaxe. I was digging out the poison, 1 square foot at a time. When the old soil was gone, I stood in the shallow pit I had created, breathing hard. I wasn't just clearing land, I was reclaiming it. I ripped open the bags of new soil, the clean, earthy smell filling my lungs. I was giving this small patch of ground a second chance, a fresh start. Later that day, I took a break and walked to the base of the oak. I ran my fingers over the small, weathered plaque. The letters of the federal law felt different under my touch. It wasn't a magic shield I had once foolishly believed in. It wasn't the jurisdictional hot potato the police had treated it as. It wasn't even the cold weapon I had been forced to wield. I saw it now as a contract, written in metal and law. A promise. And like any promise, it was worthless without someone willing to hold others to it. It required vigilance, not faith. A few days later, a formal-looking envelope arrived in the mail. It was from the chief of police. I opened it with a steady hand. Inside, A single-page letter informed me that after a review, a version of my proposed protected site protocol was being implemented citywide. There was a new dispatch flag, a new mandatory cross-agency notification requirement. The chief thanked me for my invaluable, if hard-won, civic contribution. I folded the letter and put it in my pocket. I looked out the window at the bandaged oak, then at the fresh, dark earth of the new garden bed waiting for seeds. The peace I had before Henderson was a fragile, naive thing. A peace I now knew I could never get back. It had been replaced by something heavier, something more durable. Purpose. The federal law was not just a line of text. It was a duty. And in this quiet corner of the world, I was the one who would see it kept. Spring came again. Not with a sudden burst, but with a slow, deliberate thaw that felt earned. I spent the winter rebuilding, both in the yard and in my head. The patch of dead earth where my garden had been was now a raised bed filled with rich, dark soil, waiting. The house next door stood empty and silent, a for sale sign planted in the unnaturally green lawn like a tombstone. Henderson was a name in a court file, his grand development plans reduced to a cautionary tale whispered among real estate agents. One morning in April, I heard it. A familiar, joyful chattering that sliced through the quiet air. I stepped outside, my heart lifting in a way it hadn't in a year. The purple martins were back. They swirled around the oak in a dizzying, acrobatic cloud, their calls echoing through the cul-de-sac. They investigated the old hollows, their movements confident and sure. Their home, though scarred, was still home. The great oak wore its wound like a veteran's medal. The arborist's burlap and cables were still there, but all around them, a profusion of new leaves had unfurled, a vibrant green halo against the dark furrowed bark. The tree had not only survived, it was thriving. It had faced its own mortality and had chosen to live, to reach for the sun. A few weeks later, I was planting tomato seedlings in the new garden bed when I saw my new neighbors, the Garcias, standing by the fence. They were a young couple who had bought Henderson's house at a steep discount from the bank. "Is it true?" Mrs. Garcia asked, her voice soft. She pointed a trowel at the gash in the oak's trunk. "The story about what happened?" I nodded, wiping sweat from my brow. "Most of it, yeah." "We saw the plaque," her husband added, looking up at the canopy, now alive with the swooping martins. "When our realtor told us the story, we thought he was exaggerating. A federal law right here." I walked over to the fence. "It's not just a law," I said, and the words felt truer than they ever had before. "It's a promise. To them." I nodded toward the birds. "My grandfather made it, and now we all get to help keep it." In that moment, I finally understood. The federal law wasn't a shield, a weapon, or a bureaucratic hurdle. It had become a story. It was the story of the tree, of my grandfather, of the birds who traveled thousands of miles to keep their own promise. It was the story of a community that had almost lost a piece of its soul and now held it closer. The Garcias weren't looking at a liability. They were looking at a landmark. Henderson, in his greed, had inadvertently made the tree more famous and more protected than ever. He had turned a quiet plaque into a local legend. I finished planting my garden. I watched the sun set behind the mighty, wounded oak. The peace I felt wasn't the light, easy peace of my old life. It was heavy, solid, and deep. It was the peace of a sentinel at his post, of a guardian who had been tested and had not been broken. I had learned that protecting the things you love isn't a passive state. It's an action. It requires vigilance, and sometimes it requires a fight. But looking up at the birds settling in for the night, their chatter a soft lullaby, I knew it was a fight worth having. Stories like this are a reminder of what's at stake, and sharing them is part of that vigilance. If this story meant something to you, a like or a subscribe helps me to keep telling them.